I anticipate that all of our panelists will be available momentarily, and in keeping with the theme of this panel, I offer this very, very short song. Thank you for this food, our food, this glorious, glorious food, and the minerals, and the vegetables, and the animals, and the loving hands that make it possible. So welcome everyone to this presentation about the food system. And do we have some of our presenters available? You should unmute yourselves, and the panel moderator is now welcome to take over. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, Darian, for that opening song. What a nice mystica to start our panel here. Our panel, Who's Coming to Dinner and What's on the Menu, is about the upcoming Food Systems Summit. And we'll also talk a bit, no doubt, about the pre-summit that has already happened this last July. I'll just introduce myself briefly. I'm Nettie Wiebe. I'm an organic farmer in the prairies of Canada in Saskatchewan. I've been a National Farmers Union activist and leader here for many years, and I'm currently a representative of the Via Campesina, which is a global movement of peasant, small-scale farmers, landless people, rural women and youth, Indigenous peoples, migrants and agricultural workers. And I'm a representative for that movement as in the civil society and Indigenous peoples mechanism, which is a part of the United Nations Committee on World Food Security in Rome. I have 4 panelists with me here. I'll introduce them very briefly, and they will introduce themselves in a more fulsome way when we begin this conversation. I have Jessie McInnes, and I'm not sure, can you see her in the video? Jessie McInnes, who is a Canadian. Hi, Jessie. Canadian, a young farmer from Nova Scotia with some expertise in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other Peoples Working in Rural Areas, UNDROP. Maiwa Montenegro, who is an assistant professor in environmental studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Patty Naylor, who just this morning did a brilliant job hosting Vandana Shiva in a wonderful conversation. She's an organic farmer in West Central Iowa and is currently the focal point for North America for the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism, so we work closely together. And finally, Jennifer Taylor, who is an organic small-scale farmer in Georgia and an associate professor at the Florida Agriculture and Mechanical University. So we're going to have a conversation about and share our insights about the UN Food Systems Summit. But I thought I would just set up the parameters for those who in this Congress who are perhaps not familiar with what this Congress, how this Congress is coming to be and what it represents for us and what both as a challenge and perhaps as an opportunity. I thought I would set up briefly the parameters of it. In September, in the summer of 2 years ago, actually, of 2019, the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, announced that we were going to have a United Nations Food Systems Summit 2 years from then, which is now September 21. And this was at the time welcome news because we all realize that food systems have a huge impact on all or many of the crises that we're currently confronting. And there's rising hunger, ecological harm from food production, including deforestation, soil degradation, loss of biodiversity, decimated fisheries, polluted water, and alongside that, growing rural poverty, displacement, climate change. So nobody questioned the need for an initiative to urgently transform food systems. But what was puzzling about it was that this announcement was a departure from previous summits. Previous summits have been hosted at the FAO by the Committee on World Food Security, and they are multilateral summits. Governments negotiating agreements and civil society always hosted and organized large autonomous events with strong interactions with the official summit, but the official summit was a multilateral event, government event. And what was puzzling about this, and a little alarming, was that this event is not a multilateral event. It's advertised and it's structured and framed as a multi-stakeholder event. And the background to this is that in June of 2019, the Secretary General of the United Nations signed a strategic partnership with the World Economic Forum. And the World Economic Forum advertises itself as the representative of the 1,000 largest corporations, global businesses in the world. So we know what the World Economic Forum is about. And this was in the concept note of that time at the high-level political forum in New York in 2019. The World Economic Forum was announced as co-organizing, involved in the organizing of this summit. Now, interesting, if you look on the website now of the World Food Summit, United Nations Food Summit, you will not see the World Economic Forum anywhere. In fact, the website description now is that the UN Secretary General and the Rome-based agencies crafted the Food Summit. So they've erased the presence, the obvious presence of the World Economic Forum, but that presence was very obvious from the beginning, and it was sort of illustrated by the appointment of Agnes Kalibata, who is the president of AGRA, which is the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, a Gates-funded foundation agency which is very focused on advocating for chemical agriculture, GMOs, corporate interests, big data. There's no doubt where AGRA is placed. And to appoint her as the special envoy captured in some ways two things. It highlighted their inclusivity agenda, and particularly their focus on women and the agency of women and all of this, because she's an African woman. But it also clearly indicated that the corporate interests in organizing this summit were front and center. And this is one of the things, and our panelists will engage with this more, but this move from multilateralism to multi-stakeholderism is very significant in the organization of this summit. It's advertised as being inclusive. If you have all the stakeholders in the room, they're all treated as equal, and anybody and everybody can participate. But without any consideration of the power imbalances or the position of various actors in the food system, it's in fact not inclusive. And this fiction of equality leaves the powerful around the table unchallenged and unaccountable. It hides conflicts of interest, and ignores power imbalances. So multi-stakeholder at the outset might sound like it's very inclusive, but we should have a critical eye on what that really means. Previous summits were multilateral summits. They were based on human rights with clear decision-making processes and accountability mechanisms, because governments can be held accountable, which meant that they were supposed to be based on, and they were based on the voices of rights holders and holding governments accountable to uphold those rights. That's a great difference between the current structure, this UN Food Systems Summit, and previous summits. And then the process of the summit, I'll just say a few things about this. It advertises itself as multi-stakeholder and very inclusive. So there's just been a dizzying array, and other panelists might have a better handle on this, but for me, it's just a dizzying array of platforms, dialogues, consultations, committees, documents, forums for participation, and strategically, they invited individual participants, bypassing and undermining autonomous, democratic, organized sectors. They handpicked individuals to go into to serve in many of these forums. And then there's a whole, in terms of the organization, there's a whole array of venues and processes. There's an advisory group, a scientific group, which maybe Maiwa will say a little more about. There's 5 action tracks with multiple subgroups and levers of change and work streams and a champions group and many constituencies, youth, indigenous, private sector, civil society, women, etc. Then there are heroes, and I haven't paid much attention to the heroes. I'm clearly not on that list. And then there were regional and national dialogues and self-organized dialogues, and just a huge volume of materials. Some of it, no doubt, very good material, well-researched material, well-thought-out material on food systems and food systems transformation. But what's puzzling about this process is that the outcome and the processes are really very opaque. There's been, they say, more than 2,000 ideas, solutions received, and they're collated into 15 action areas with more than 50 solution clusters. And it's not clear just what the criteria was on which these were graded and selected, and who is accountable for them. So the project seems to be that there's all these game-changing propositions, and they will initiate and are initiating various coalitions of action. But actually, the whole process it lacks transparency. And it really raises some real questions about legitimacy. Who's actually making decisions on this? On what grounds? Who is accountable? And to whom? So in the face of this, and I'll wrap up quickly here, but in the face of this, we at the Civil Society Mechanism and many people's organizations, a broad array of farmers, fishers, women and youth, environmentalists, researchers, joined together and mobilized and had a counter mobilization just to highlight what the problems, some of the key problems, such as that this Food Systems Summit is not grounded in human rights, although now that they've heard that criticism from the special rapporteurs on human rights and many, many others, that the human rights grounding is missing, there is in fact in the literature a lot of human rights language, but it's unclear, it's there, but it's unclear what kind of a footing it has. The other key problem we had with this in the counter mobilization, which was clearly articulated, is that this seems to represent a kind of corporate capture of the United Nations. This multi-stakeholderism is it looks like it's a partnership with the corporate sector, agribusiness, that will help to establish stakeholder capitalism as the governance model for the entire planet. That's what it could be the result of this, because there's no binding rules anywhere. And when we were critiquing this from the civil society mechanism, ask specifically to have an action track on conflicts of interest. It's very clear that the corporate sector, agribusiness, industrial agriculture has a huge impact on these other crises we're facing. In fact, is a generator of some of these basic problems. So we wanted to see if the corporate sector is engaged in this, is there clarity around their conflict of interest? And that couldn't happen. So our problems as civil society, as movements with this whole initiative are pretty deep-seated. We have seen that the summit is taking on board some of our criticisms. There's human rights language, there's lots of sustainability. There was a very active recruitment of women and youth into the processes. And as I said, some very, very strong and good interventions in the pre-summit in July. So we have problems with it, but that's basically the setup that I wanted to articulate, to set up for our panelists to engage in. Now I'm going to go, we're not going to have the standard panel, we'll have a conversation. So I'm going to invite the panelists to each of them to locate themselves more generally and say a little bit more about themselves, and ask them, what is your key concern with regards to this UN Food Systems Summit discourse on food systems transformation? So I'll begin there with Patty.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Greetings. We saw each other earlier today. Thank you, Nettie, for that explanation of what's happening. I am in Iowa. I'm an organic farmer here and surrounded by millions of acres of corn and soybeans that are used to feed livestock in confinements and feedlots. My concerns are multiple. When you look at what the corporations are saying, even now after they've had some criticism, we understand that corporations have learned how to talk about food and food systems in ways that make it look like they are sustainable. They're trying to be more climate friendly. But I think a lot of it is greenwashing, and it is used for their own benefit. For instance, putting a label on a food product that says that this was created in a regenerative, organic, or sustainable way may be true, but we need to change all of our organic or all of our farming to an organic agroecological system. So by focusing on individual labels like that, I think is part of the problem of the corporate capture of our food system. But more than that, here in Iowa, we can see what this industrial agriculture system is doing to us. It's harming our water and our air and our soil. It's also leading us to fewer and fewer farmers, chemicals and GMOs everywhere. That is, most of the corn and soybeans that are grown are genetically engineered and uses chemical pesticides and synthetic fertilizers to be grown. And then the livestock in confinements, instead of being on the farms in more sustainable, regenerative ways, is a very serious problem here, as in other places. My big concern is that what we see is not going to stay the same. It's not going to stay like this. It's changing. And that trajectory that we are on is where we, as Vandana Shiva said this morning, we are on a path where we have farming without farmers. And I think that is a very serious concern, because it's people on the ground, on the land, who are caring for that land, So this farming without farmers being replaced by technology, being placed by management in distant cities by computer, and immigrant and other labor issues would be doing the work. So I think that's very serious. What we see is a financialization of land, soil, water, putting a price tag on even our soil when it sequestering carbon as in a carbon market, a false solution to climate change. We see the digitalization of agriculture, where our data is so very, very important to the corporations so they can profit from that, so that our crops. I actually was on a webinar like this with our local CEO of the local farmers cooperative, who told farmers that he sees in the future that our crops, the data from our crops, could be worth more than the crops themselves. That is dangerous. The crops should be priced in a way that reflects the cost of producing those crops. The technological solutions are replacing the social and political solutions that really need to be discussed. Technological solutions are really a distraction from what the real solution should be. And when we talk about food system transformation, we need to understand that the corporations have their view and they know how to talk about it. They know the language to be used. We need to be able to articulate and envision the kind of agriculture that we want, one that's based on human rights, including the indigenous peoples and peasants with ancestral knowledge, access to land rights, and also local economies. We want an agriculture that is in common with nature, like agroecology. I think I'll stop there and we'll go on to the next panelist.
Thanks, Patty. You flagged something that we earlier had already mentioned, and that's the language and a critical stance towards how this is being framed and shaped. Meuka.
Thank you, Patty, and thank you, Nettie. The remarks that I had prepared, I think, were brilliantly articulated by Nettie. So I think the biggest concern, as I see it, is this shifting dynamic from multilateralism to multi-stakeholderism, and the, in effect, as we see it, a strategic move to possibly privatize the United Nations system altogether. I think part of what makes it difficult is that on the one hand, multilateralism also has its significant challenges. And so social movement groups for a long time have witnessed the shifting of the multilateral governance of food at the global level towards a more neoliberal and privatized public-private partnership model. And that's where we saw the emergence of the discourse of food sovereignty as an alternative to a food security that didn't care for whom or by whom food was produced. Food security could be achieved through globalized trade, and of course through the World Trade Organization playing a very strong role in supporting that kind of logic of food security. So we have this kind of push and challenge on the one flank from social movements who are pressing for either a food sovereignty alternative to food security or a transition of food security to be more like food sovereignty. On the other hand, we have the World Economic Forum, the Gates Foundation, that investor class writ large, trying to, I think, undercut and undermine some of the institutions of the UN system. Unfortunately, it is now branded under the UN and has the kind of legitimacy of seeking to achieve the SDGs and so forth. I think you put it really well, Nettie, that it, from an outside observer, it is very attractive, partly because it's so confusing. It is, I struggle for the right kinds of adjectives, but I'm thinking of like Rococo, it's Baroque, it's very ornate and flowery. There's a lot of attractive language. There's women's empowerment, there's youth ambassadors. If you were to come to this 2 years on, you would think it was very inclusive. But understanding what a food sovereign approach and a feminist approach is very attentive to process, right? We know that you don't bake a cake and decide to add your yeast and your sugar and your key ingredients after you've stuck the cake in the oven. It doesn't work that way, right? You have already created the structure of your product. And I feel like the way Indigenous groups, women, civil society is being treated as like icing, icing on the cake. We're going to make this attractive. We are not going to be transparent about how decisions are made, about how some solution clusters thrive and others don't. There's a lot to be said about the role of science, technology, and innovation in the summit, but I think I'll save those comments for a bit later so we can have a little bit more dialogue here. But thank you for that.
Mewa, love the cake image. That's great. All right, Jessie, weigh in here.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for all the comments so far. My name is Jessie McGuinness, and I'm a small-scale organic farmer based in Nova Scotia, Canada. I got to know Nettie through the National Farmers Union, and I'm now the youth vice president of the NFU, and I also participate in the youth working group of the civil society mechanism. So my biggest concern about the Food System Summit is a lot of what has already been said, but I think more specifically that where the summit makes time and space for these game-changing solutions that it purports, which are really thinly veiled corporate interests, people's rights and the needs of the actual food producers are being shoved under the rug. The knowledge of small producers is being kind of dominated by that of the corporate interest. And as we're decades into sort of the neoliberal globalization project, we know that corporate interest and human rights rarely, if ever, have truly meaningful overlap. My supposition is that this summit will fail to acknowledge truly the need for rights-based public policies for agriculture, despite the fact that as a United Nations summit, it should be doing exactly that, centering these human rights mandates. So I've been involved for the last couple of years with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas, which La Via Campesina brought to the General Assembly in 2018, and it was adopted and supported by 122 states. I may have that number off. And in it, we find a lot of strong language related to things like seed sovereignty, right to land, migrant workers' rights, women's rights, access to alternative agriculture education, and so on. Really a groundwork for food system transformation based on food sovereignty. And despite being a UN instrument supported by a social movement made up of millions of peasants, the declaration is not meaningfully incorporated into the summit and has not been since its start. So what does this really say about food systems transformation, what that means to the summit organizers, if it's not even supporting rights-based frameworks like the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants, despite the fact that it is a blueprint by and for the majority of food producers the world over. So rightfully so, the Via Campesina and their allies are furious. We know that we need food systems transformation, and something like a food system summit is an ideal place to share experiences, to share knowledge horizontally. But the Food System Summit is definitely not that place. And the fact that so many have been kind of blindsided into thinking that it is a place for meaningful transformational dialogue is frankly quite scary. And it's doubly scary to see how the UN has bowed to this corporate pressure to allow this summer to put multi-stakeholderism at its center. And I think that where I see some hope is that with the counter mobilization that occurred last month and which will happen next month during the summit, is that there's a demand to return to multilateral dialogues and hold up people's rights that states, that movements alike have supported, like the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants. And there's no reason why the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants shouldn't be centered aside from pure corporate greed, upholding the power structures to maintain the status quo. So my concern is that the Food System Summit can persuade these like uncritical governments and stakeholders that corporate agriculture continues to be the way forward. And this notion is incredibly dangerous, as it really tries to put human rights and food sovereignty on a shelf, sort of out of sight and out of mind. So I think I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. It's noteworthy that the Declaration of the Rights of Peasants doesn't feature in the Food System Summit, and that the special emissary Agnes Kalibati actually early in a public meeting said there are no peasants. So let's move on here. Jennifer, make your opening statements, and then, right. Jennifer Taylor.
Here she comes. Jennifer, I've made you a co-host so you can get in.
Okay, great. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I was trying to unmute myself. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here on this panel and to participate with each one of you and to hear the issues and the harm done through the formation and through the path that the United Nations Food System Summit has chosen to take. This path impacts all of us. I feel that there is a strong lack in proposing and supporting and developing strategies that support the benefits of agroecology, farm practices, the benefits of organic farming systems to the largest number of farmers in the world, our small farmers, our smallholder farmers, our underserved, therefore small farm populations. And I feel that that lack in providing strategies and information and the benefits of agroecology and organic farming systems to our and about our small farmers has led to an increase in the role of agro businesses and the role of business as usual, because we would like to see, because they would like to see them as non-existent, as alienated from the food system, when in actuality, they form the basis of our local food systems. And they are essential to providing fresh local produce to our communities. Another issue that I see the Food System Summit lacking in is also not providing information about the benefits of the livelihoods associated with agroecology farming systems and organic farming systems, those thriving livelihoods, and also the family support systems that enable our communities to grow and benefit from agroecology and organic farming systems. And I think that that is an underlying message that is left out, but would engage our focus, would engage their focus to what is important and the issues that need to be addressed. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Jennifer, we're not seeing your video, so if you can.
I had to. I was in. Well, I'm at my farm, and we don't have internet access. And I was in the public library, and the library has closed. So now I'm using my phone. So I had to leave for a moment and dial back in through my phone. I don't have access right now.
Okay, well, we're missing your lovely face, but we just have to imagine it then. Thanks for the contribution. Thanks for those opening remarks, which kind of locate your key concerns. I'm just going to ask the next round of questions here. Is this Food Systems Summit, my question is it addressing power and gender disparities, actually who's on the agenda, who's accountable, and more particularly, how will women fare in these proposed system transformations? What's your sense of that? I'll open with Mewa.
Sure. And I probably want to bracket my remarks in that I'm not a gender scholar or somebody who identifies with kind of a deep scholarly background in feminist theory. But I think what's quite obvious to most observers with their eyes open, it's not as if the UNFSS is not talking about or not purporting to include women. So we've got some complicated politics of inclusion, as you mentioned earlier. For example, on the scientific group, which is one of these groups that has been carved out within the UN Food System Summit structure that has quite a bit of decision-making power, is Dr. Louise Fresco, a woman, the president of Wageningen University and Research in the Netherlands. And of course, Dr. Agnes Kalibata is a woman. If you look through the remaining solutions clusters, and you'll see exciting labels like gender transformative approaches for inclusive and sustainable food systems. There's about 3 or 4 solutions clusters that are very much pointed at and framed around women and gender. Yet I think also this shows that it's very wrong-headed and problematic to confuse including women with a feminist approach. And so it is not really about inviting a few Black, Brown, and Indigenous people to be ambassadors or to evoke women's empowerment at key opportunities, however well-intentioned those individuals might be. And I think, unfortunately, some of the youth have been recruited to have, it's hard because due to social movement pushback, there has been a move to invite folks in. So I think there's some, unfortunately, people who are bound up in that gap, maybe naively not understanding quite what's happening, but also there's very much a strategic move to include women and youth. I think a feminist approach is much more, and this is borrowed from some beautiful language from the Basque Declaration, where women of La Via Campesina came together and said, it's not about, it's about creating power with one another rather than over one another. So, and in this sense, women having a non-hierarchical decision-making structure and approach to one another and with the living world around them. It's about, in my view, the broader picture of colonialism and capitalism and breaking down some of these binaries between subjects and objects. So, right, this subject-object binary is what allows the objectification of nature, the extraction of value from land, seeds, water. It's what enables some subjects to treat others as objects, whether it's masters and slaves or men objectifying women. If the UNFSS were taking an actual anti-patriarchal approach, we would not see it taking on this faux inclusivity process in the guise of multi-stakeholderism that in effect allows some groups to be dominated by others. It's not about actually an equitable and redistributive decision-making process. We already know that they ignored the Office of Human Rights for well over a year. We know that they were resistant to the insistent demands by the civil society, Indigenous peoples and civil society mechanism to sever that strategic partnership with the World Economic Forum. And we know that they have been kind of disingenuously using agroecology as a tool, suggesting that it can be combined with all the other things, climate smart and precision agriculture and genetic engineering and digitalization. And all of those things are just going to be win-win-win solutions for the future of food. They are unable to wrestle with anything about problems. They only want to talk about solutions. And if you don't have a shared analysis of those problems, I think you're going to wind up creating solutions that reproduce the problems. So I know that's a little bit off of women particularly, but I think the deeper question is that this is not a feminist approach. It's not an anti-patriarchal approach. So whomever wants to take up the baton, I'll gladly pass it on.
Thank you, Maywa. Yeah, that's an important observation. So much of the language, when you delve a little deeper into it, is how to empower women so that they will adapt and become participant in the value chains. And when you unpack that language, that sort of makes clear what you've put on the table here. So thanks. Jessie.
Hi again. Yeah, so as Maiwa mentioned, gender is really centered on the agenda, but the process and the sort of underbelly of the summit is really perpetuating the contemporary standard for a very heteropatriarchal capitalist food system that at the end of the day is treating food as a commodity and nothing else. So as we've talked about already, the origins of the summit really laid that patriarchal foundation that has shaped what we're seeing today. And truly, despite the fact that a lot of women are involved in the leadership positions, this leadership is being shaped by these corporate forces that are pushing their agendas forward. And unfortunately, the summit has done a really good job of creating an illusion of inclusivity. And that's really what makes it so dangerous, that sort of the latent subversive patriarchal structures that are underpinning it, moving the corporate agenda forward despite an appearance of a diversity of ideas. Really what they're doing is changing definitions of, for example, agroecology to fit into their narrative. And based on this sort of model of food systems transformation that they're trying to get across, when women and gender non-binary people will not fare well. Corporate agriculture has never been and is not feminist in nature. It's a business transaction, and it's concerned with the bottom line, as business transactions are, and not with the fact that women, despite producing, storing, preparing much of the world's food, still struggle to own land, access resources, have much agency over the systems of production on farms and throughout the food chain. So to me, food system transformation rooted in agroecology is in itself rooted in what we call in the Via Campesina popular peasant feminism. And this requires an intersectional approach linking farming practices, food production, and consumption with economic and social justice, and they can't be separated. So women and gender non-binary peoples really require transformation at the end of the day in power relations in food systems. And based on who is setting the agenda for this summit, that's not what's in store.
So true, so true. And thanks for just raising up what is obvious to all of us who are women farmers and who cook dinners and who are most of the women of the world. We're key to providing food. So thanks for raising that up as a key component here. Jennifer, can we hear you again? We're so sorry we don't see you. But...
Yeah, I'm sorry. And
I
I agree with all that's being said about the important role that women serve in building lives and communities and nurturing our families and our communities, as well as being primarily the main farmers in many areas of the world. I do think that those are issues that are represented in the past in the United Nations and their efforts. Not so much has changed to me right now. However, I do feel also it's important to hear the voice of Black Indigenous farmers and farmers of color communities and the voices of women within those communities. And I think that those voices have not been heard and aren't at the table and aren't present as we talk about the United Nations Food System Summit. But their voices are equally important. And that's just another issue that needs to be present at the time when decisions are being made, as you all know, and not just coming behind to join into the decisions that have already been made. But I agree with all that has been said. Thank you.
Jennifer, thanks for that contribution and that reminder. I mean, the Committee on World Food Security has in its foundational, its principles, that it is there to hear and to protect the interests of the most vulnerable. It's a great sorrow and a great injustice that it is often women of color in particular, who are the most vulnerable in our food systems, and who are also the biggest contributors to food security in their household and communities, but who are also rendered most vulnerable. And their rights are the least often realized, recognized, and supported. So thanks for putting that into the conversation here. Patty, do you want to respond to this question of how women are faring in this proposed transformation that the Food Systems Summit is discussing?
Thanks. I'll just add a little bit because the other panelists have said it so well. Certainly, if women do not have access to land often or financial opportunities. Who controls the capital in our agriculture system determines the kind of food that we have. But women are so involved in the food system through unpaid labor, which is sometimes ignored. The informal economies is a very big part of women and how they access the food for their families. During the pandemic, this past year, women have been very, very harmed, very, very impacted in a negative way by the closure of farmers markets, local produce, and instead the corporations are pushing things like supermarkets instead of the local economies that provide both livelihoods and fresh produce and fresh foods for local communities. So these are things that are a part of this discussion. Water is going to be a big concern for women. It's not just the food, but also their clean water for their families. And climate change is impacting women as they are the nurturers, the food providers, the food for their immediate families. And climate change is creating climate refugees as people have to move to a different place because of the climate. And women are going to be very, very vulnerable, as you say, to these kinds of things in the future, now and into the future. And our our agriculture system is a huge part of what women are experiencing.
Thanks. Let's just have a discussion on the next issue here, and that is we're all on the ground. Most of us are farmers, actually, participants in this food system, and we're also watching, as this panel demonstrates, we're also watching the national and the international policy frameworks, governance frameworks being shifted increasingly. And we saw this, of course, with the trade agreements, the World Trade Organization and the trade agreements, that there was a huge impact on our local prospects, our local food systems, and the power dynamic in foods, creating menus with the World Trade Organization. At that time, the United Nations remained as the multilateral body which had governance over and was in some ways could have been in a position to hem in the egregious outliers of the World Trade Organization agreements. But at this point now we see, and that's what I wanted to say in the opening piece, we see now that this governance framework, this regulation, this regulatory framework is also being usurped and shifted. So we've got some big challenges. COVID offered us a huge challenge locally in many of our households, on our farms, in our own small marketing channels, etc. So we know that we have to deal with these on the local level, but we also now have these global challenges. So I'm wondering, and this is a big question, and I'm just going to ask panelists to weigh in here, and I'm hoping, Maywa, that you'll weigh in on the science and knowledge piece, but I'm wondering what each of us are doing to in our own way to counter the current system, to protect our communities, our public institutions, and to create more just, diverse, healthier food systems around us. I mean, we're all of us in some ways engaged. All of us are in our own kitchens doing some part of that work. Some of us are on our land doing some part of that work in our communities. Some of us, as we noted in the introduction, are also working in other places. And I'm just wondering, this is an open question, and I just want people to weigh in and just give us some ideas and some anecdotal, some firsthand experience of what we do in the face of this as women who want to create a better world around us. So, Maywa, you're on.
Thank you. Thanks for that. The challenge, the provocation is a big one. I will answer it a bit pragmatically and somewhat narrowly from the vantage point of a researcher who has a salaried job at an academic institution. Gives me a little bit of freedom to organize and do research-based work and not sacrifice like my family's income because I'm not paying attention to my farm. But through the lens of knowledge struggles and what I see the UN food system is trying to do is to create a division where they own the science and all the opposition are the activists, the food sovereignty people, the people who don't really understand science. And in that bifurcation, they are really trying hard to create a narrative that they are evidence-based, scientific, understand history and future of innovation. And if you don't understand that, you're either fearful or ignorant, and you will soon come around to seeing the light, right? And so I think one of the big roles that researchers, educators, scholar activists can do, and what I've been trying to work with alongside other scholar activists, is to disrupt that binary and say, there are researchers out here who disagree. There is loads of scientific evidence from complex field-based ecology to rural political economy to science and technology studies that actually does not agree with how science is being used, a very reductionist and narrow understanding of science that basically holds that development goes on a linear trajectory, and as you amass more technological instruments, you will achieve upward mobility and ever expanding potentials for control over nature, accumulation of wealth, and so forth. That is progress. In fact, that is embedded in the ideas of development underpinning even the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs around which the UN Food Systems Summit is framed. So we have researchers over here who are saying, let's expand the field of science. Let's also understand that science is only one cosmovision, right? The Elizabeth Mpofu, when I was a grad student at Berkeley, she came to give a talk in the Diversified Farming Systems Center as I was a young grad student. And she stood up there and she said, sometimes we say that science is one interesting cosmovision, you know, so to understand that within the constellation of world making, of knowledge production, and of understanding how we are being on this planet in relation to one another and the earth. Science is one way of doing that, but it's not the only way. So there are researchers who understand that, who are leaning into it, and who want to develop agroecology in a governance framework rooted in human rights and in food sovereignty. We have launched a boycott petition asking our colleagues to please not engage, do not lend your scientific legitimacy to the summit with your participation, because that's what they want. They want you to show up, and then they'll say, like, look, we're so inclusive. If they are already involved, to bring their critical lenses, to sit in those places and critique what's going on, to critique the process. We have also, and when I say we, I'm speaking of a group that I organize with called the Agroecology Research Action Collective. I'll put a link to that boycott into the chat. A number of us have peeled off from that group and have joined a global group of scholars who are working sort of behind the scenes, but really trying to use our research lenses to unpack, to interrogate, and to better understand the corporate capture of governance, the corporate capture of science, and to lend our research lenses, the work that we do. You know, you have different types of work, just as you have different types of knowledge, and to lend that to social movements in support of achieving a just, food sovereign, and agroecological world. So I will just put those links into the chat so that folks can explore. We've got a whole collection of sign-on letters, petitions, and the boycott letter in addition. Thank you.
Maiwa, I cannot tell you how important that work is, because knowledge is power. And we in North America here are captured by a very narrow vision of what's knowledge. And your way of opening that up opens up a huge arena of power. And let me just say, as a farmer and as someone who's done farm politics, it's one of our problems, or big problems, is that we farmers are often seen as ignorant. We don't have knowledge. The knowledge, agriculture colleges and scientists have the knowledge. And so we better listen up. And it's a position of extreme powerlessness when you find yourself in a place where you are the ignorant. And that's where farmers often find themselves. So those who criticize farmers for being eager to accommodate and try and adopt technologies don't understand the social pressure of feeling like you're in the hinterland, you're not worthy, you don't know anything. And our attempts as farmers to be on deck, not to be re-described that way. So your work on expanding what knowledge comes to, and opening the door to respecting and actually honoring the kinds of knowledge that people who are every day working in the soil or fishing or in forestry, that's ever so important. So thanks for that. And also thanks for those references in the links. I open it. Who wants to weigh in?
This is Jennifer.
Jennifer. Come on in.
Okay, thanks. I agree with Marla. I do think there is a strong control issue, control of knowledge, as well as control of choice. And so I have a background, a master's and a bachelor's in agronomy. And my doctorate study was in teaching and learning, vocational and technical education. And so what I see taking place in agriculture is how we work with farmers to have them share in the specific type of knowledge system that we want them, to share in and gain access to, and removing the choice. And by so removing the choice for farmers to choose better strategies for their land. And so I feel that it's important for us to be vigilant about the benefits and the strategies that are involved in agroecology farming systems and organic farming systems practices. So at my farm, we have a certified organic farm where we use agroecology farm practices, and we grow vegetables and fruit, but we also have capacity building sessions from our farm for not only BIPOC farmers, but for farmers at large. And farmers come and learn about the benefits of organic farming systems, the benefits of agroecology farm strategies. If they are interested in the certification for organic agriculture, we can share that information too. But I feel that having that kind of hands-on approach in the community is important. As well as at Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, I developed our statewide small farm program, which focuses on agroecology and organic farming systems and the benefits to sustainable living, thriving living, the benefits to alternative market strategies and providing a more nutritious, healthy food system, and the benefits to our environment. And I think it's important for us to be able to share this knowledge. And our focus at Florida A&M University through this program is on underserved small farm populations. So what we feel that we're doing is empowering and enabling and building relationships with underserved or small farm populations, BIPOC farmers and their communities to improve, not only improve the food system, but improve their health, the well-being strategies that go on, improve the health of the farm and improve the health of the food system.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. We have only 2-3 minutes left here. I want Patty and Jesse to weigh in if you've got time. And we have one question which we may not get to. I'm afraid one of our panelists will have to answer it. One of our American panelists will have to answer it. But Patty and or Jesse. Patty, quick last word here.
All right. Political education is really important. We want food sovereignty. Farmer livelihoods are critical. So political education needs to include the economic realities of why we have the system we have and what the system is that farmers have to actually engage in.
Thanks, Patty. Jesse.
Okay, I'll be very brief.
It is so fitting that the youngest panelist gets the last word. Go ahead.
So I think as we're looking beyond the Food System Summit, really what I would encourage everyone to do is really go beyond your local food movement when thinking about food systems transformation. And so this means beyond shopping at a farmer's market or participating in a community-supported agriculture program. As concerned citizens, we need to understand our local food systems beyond consumption. So we need to understand how farm workers in our communities are treated, how the Indigenous people's rights are upheld, who holds the land, and how we can change these things from a structural perspective. We need to understand what food sovereignty is and can be in our communities. And we need public institutions to support the pillars of agroecology. So this means working at multiple different levels, of course. And I think I'll just leave it at that because I know we're right at the end.
Thank you so much. Multiple different levels, multitasking, that's us as women. So let's go for it. Thank you so much to the wonderful panelists. I hope that those of you who participated in this session come away understanding the United Food Systems Summit